Thank you everyone for joining at the second edition of the Conversation Room of the FIAC happening at the Grand Palais Éphémère this year. I'm Victoria, I'm taking care of the Conversation Room this year, and I'm going to very briefly introduce Zineb Sedira, Sam Bardaouil, and Fellrath. Zineb is the artist representing France at the next Venice Biennale in 2022. Sam Bardaouil and Fellrath, the curators of the French Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2022, as well as the Lyon Biennale. They are also the director of the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, and Yasmina Reggad, who were supposed to join us today as the curating team, but she's not able to, so she will be missed. But I'm letting Zineb and Sam until go on with the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Victoria, for the introduction. It's lovely to be here virtually. You know, it's an opportunity for us to start talking a little bit about what we are developing and have been working on with Zineb over the last month for the French Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2022. Perhaps we can start by talking a little bit about our friendship with Zineb and the way we have worked together in the past. And then we can start zooming in a little bit about the Biennale, about the Pavilion, keeping in mind that this is only a teaser. We're not going to say everything yet because things are still being cooked. But we hope that this will be just the beginning of many conversations leading up to the Biennale. So perhaps this is how we will start, and then we can go more into detail. I don't know, before we do that, if Zineb has an introductory thing she would like to say or tell.
Not really. not yet, anyway. Yeah, but since you spoke about friendship, yeah, I don't know if you were going to expand on this one, but we obviously have known each other for quite some time. We worked the first time in 2009, I think, for a show that happened in 2010. And then we had other projects together. And we kept seeing each other and meeting each other each time we were coming to London or we're meeting in a place or another. You've always been very supportive, or even if we were not working together, you'd come at openings and things like that. So that's our friendship, and the same with Yasmina Reggad, who has been a friend for a long time, and also her and I have created this residency project in Algiers, so that I also bounded us professionally, and as a friend. And that we will see later on that this project for Venice is also about friendship. But perhaps I'll pass it on back to you, Sam.
Yes, I mean, until I'd say something. Hello, everyone. And yes, Zineb, I think that's absolutely true. And I think sometimes people ask a question, how long have you been working on the Pavilion? And, how do you work together? And I think the matter of fact is, I think we started working on this project in some sense, maybe 12 years ago when we first met, when we were working on this commission for the exhibition Told, Untold, Retold in Doha. As you said, we've had countless conversations, laughters, dinners, drinks. We visited exhibitions together. So I think when we started approaching the Pavilion, we already had a really, really solid starting base, and I think a great sense of trust. And I know that the same applies to Yasmina as well. I mean, you've known her for a very, very long time. You did many, many projects together, but also so did Sam and I. We've known her for a very long time. So I think the decision on your end to bring us all together and work on as a team on this has been a really, fantastic experience for all of us. I think we complement one another in a really great way. Mm-hmm. And I also think that our role as curators of this National Pavilion perhaps is much more one of supporting you in creating this project, and perhaps putting structures in place and giving you that safe place to create the work that you need to create. It's a very exposed exhibition. It's this big solo project that comes with a lot of expectations, a lot of baggage as well, for being a national pavilion in Venice, for being the French National Pavilion on top of it. So it comes with a lot of these kind of questions. And I think Yasmina, and I know that in this part I can speak for her as well, that I think we all feel very strongly about supporting you and giving you that support in all our different experiences and our different cultural backgrounds, and just making sure that the pavilion that you envision will be as good as possible. And we've been really having a lot of fun in the process doing it, and we know it's going to be a fantastic project, and we are very glad and excited to be part of it.
Great. So basically what we can do now, I'm going to just show you a little evidence of all the crimes that we have committed together in the past. So we've prepared just quickly a few visual things to show you. So Till, for instance, has already spoken about our first collaboration. This was back in 2009 when we started working on a new commission with Zineb for Told, Untold, Retold. It was the inaugural contemporary art exhibition for the Arab Museum of Modern Art, Bahnhof in Doha. And that was really the beginning of a friendship. And here you see some of the evidence of that work. So this was the process.
I think it's the other way around.
Yes, it is the other way around. So this is basically, you know, some of the documentation of the ideas of the process and how we were working together to develop an installation, which was then featured in many of Zineb's exhibitions in the future. So The End of the Road is a 2-channel video installation that also kind of came with a series of light boxes that depicted, you know, images of a shipyard, a car, a wreck yard, where you see the destruction of these cars and a narration by Zineb on top of these very violent and sometimes perhaps almost, you know, provocative images that have a certain undertone. And obviously it's a commentary on migration, on, you know, movement, on the connection and the inability perhaps to connect sometimes, and the vehicles of connection and migration and communication. So that was just one of the very, very early, the first and earliest project we worked on. And then a few years later, it was in 2014, we invited Zineb on an exhibition at the Gwangju Museum of Art in Gwangju in South Korea. And we had the privilege to show Middle Sea, that these are images of the installation. So we showed Middle Sea, one of Zineb's seminal iconic films, always in a sense a continuation of some of these ideas that have been very central to her work, and a selection of several of her photographic installations, you know, like Untitled, like Maritime Nonsense, like The Lovers. So this was also another continuation of that conversation that started back in 2009. And then we had the privilege also to work with Zineb on her first solo gallery exhibition at Timur Grani Projects. I think that was in New York, and that was back in 2016. So as you can see, every 2 or 3 years, we had an occasion to develop something new. And that was also a very special project because it captured at the time a new body of work that Zineb had been developing, Museum of Traces, basically the sugar silos, Registre du Phare. So you can see, again, us having the opportunity to continue our work with Zineb and accompany her over the years on different occasions with different series and bodies of work. And then, of course, along these, as these projects were developing, we were always seeing her other projects or other exhibitions. The friendship was always developing. And this is, in a sense, just to give you a little context of how the work that we're doing now on the pavilion is just a continuation of a long process of exchange, of nurture, of being, you know, springboards for each other to think together, to reflect together, and grow together. So thank you, Zineb, for giving us this opportunity to continue this beautiful journey with you.
And maybe building on that a little bit, while of course we cannot talk about the project for Venice in detail, there has to be also a little bit of a surprise, but I think we can maybe talk about some of the main concerns in your practice. And I think the examples that Sam was giving here are actually really, really powerful. And perhaps we can ask you a first question. You know, you are representing France, but you've been living in the UK for, I think, over 25 years. You are British as much as you're French, but of course you're also born to an Algerian family in Paris and in France. So you have these three different cultures in you. And now here you are representing France at the Venice Biennale with all the expectations that the pavilion carries. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about this idea of identity and how do you deal with this in this highly politicized context and this complex, you know, societies and everything that comes with it, and how it links a little bit to your personal history and your personal biography. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, obviously, when you are nominated to do something like that, to represent a country, whatever the country is, comes into mind what it means, this idea of the nation, of the mother country, and all those questions about, you know, identity politics comes up. And of course, like you said, very rightly, I'm French, I'm British, and I'm Algerian also. Just because I've been really experiencing those three kind of cultural elements within my, of course, for the French and the Algerian during my childhood, and later on, and Britain more as an adult when I decided to go and live in England later on, and I also studied art in the UK rather than in France. So, of course, this question of, am I French? Do I deserve representing France? Was an interesting one, because I did think actually that was exactly the right thing to be doing, to actually show that the French pavilion can also be Algerian and can also be British as much as it can be French. And that now, if we look at the demographics of France or any other European countries, you don't have anymore this kind of identity of being purely French, whatever that means, because, you know, France has been mixed for a long time by, perhaps more at the time, European immigration, but more recently, more by African and North African immigrants. So I think it's actually fantastic to be able to do a project, my project, that might be based perhaps, or perhaps not, within those three kind of countries, but beyond that, because we might be coming and experiencing those identities, but our research, our travels, our artists might have also made us interested or attached to another culture, another country, purely because we like, or the experience we had there, you know, has proven to be very rich. So yes, we have those kind of formal identities. In my case, it's French Algerian because I've got the nationality, I've got the passport of those two countries. Britain is because of my long-lasting adult experience. And then there are other countries where I tend to gravitate towards too, just because either I like people there, I like their history, I just like going there. So, I mean, we all know now that identity is not a fixed kind of a concept or notion anymore. That, I mean, I don't know really anyone who has one identity. I mean, everyone comes from somewhere. And therefore, I think the French pavilion is totally fitted, appropriate to me, because I am also French.
Absolutely, Zineb. I think, this is not something that is just something that you see in France, you see it in many, many other countries. And even if you are maybe subscribing more closely to one identity, doesn't mean that you have many, many other identities or cultural groups that you belong to. And as you say, many people nowadays actually have more than one culture, one group, by either being of mixed heritage or by having lived in different countries. I think the idea that you have to subscribe to one singular entity seems very relevant to the reality of many people nowadays. When you migrate, you can even connect with your country more easily through Zoom. You can travel easily. You can speak more than one language in a household. And I think that reality is something that is really wonderful to embrace. And I think you are embracing this. You are not so different. I think you probably represent much more the majority of people in reality when one takes a second look than maybe one takes a first look. And maybe what we can also speak a little bit about is how that manifests itself in the pavilion in a formal way. You always have been a great filmmaker. You realized many, many projects also involving your own family, very autobiographical, but you have always used film as a medium in your practice since the very beginning. And you were also, telling us all the anecdotes of going to the cinema in Gennevilliers, where you grew up with your dad. Can you tell us a little bit about what does cinema represent to you personally, and how do you think it is a great medium to express what you're trying to express in this perhaps complicated context. But can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with cinema and what will happen maybe a little bit going forward?
I mean, it's true, from a very young age, I had a privilege in some ways relationship with my father, who would take me to the cinema in Gennevilliers, a cinema that doesn't exist anymore, for the first cinema I went to, and it was a cinema where my dad would take me to see Italian cinema, popular cinema, or populist cinema, and the Italian film we were watching were the peplums, of course, and the Western spaghetti. And then also there was a lot of Egyptian movies shown in that cinema. It was a cinema, although it was run by French owners, the majority of the people who come to cinema were from the immigrant community. And I think that's why they were showing films who were more populist, perhaps, rather than more intellectual kind of a cinema, if you want. So yeah, I was informed by a very young age by all those peplums, you know, which I found were amazing. And of course, the Egyptian one with the music, the dancing, the kissing, the whatever. So, I mean, you know, they were quite interesting juxtapositions just to really, when you think about it now. But they were definitely made for, you know, populist kind of a cinema, you know. And then during my teenagers years, because Gennevilliers being a communist city, and it also had a cinema called, at the time it was called La Maison pour Tous, now it's called Cinéma Jean Vigo. I think it was created in the 1930s, but I started going there as a teenager, because then we moved from where the other cinema was to a closer estate near the Jean Vigo cinema. So my cinema interest carried on developing as a teenager, but the cinema Jean Vigo, it was more like a cinema d'arrêt d'essai. The films were much more either political, militant, or artistic, if you want. So I kind of, yeah, from a very young age, in some ways, escaped in those cinema spaces. Of why the medium of cinema or film in my practice, it's also because I'm really interested in stories, in telling stories, and to listening to stories, and what best way to actually record a story is via video or sound recording, and the film space or the video space gives you that possibility to record sound as well as the voice and the face. So I've for a long time, I've kind of developed a strategy which looks more at interview, kind of like the piece I did with my parents, the piece I did with me and my mom and my daughter. It was always a kind of quite simple kind of way of filming. And then the work changed a bit in 2001, where I started not involving people anymore, actors. So it became between fiction and reality. And then more recently, I went back to this idea of the archives and started working in the archive. I wanted to record people to speak about some element of the archive. And you can see that, for example, with Gardienne d'Image, where Safia Kouassi talks about her husband, Mohamed Kouassi, and the photography took during the Algerian War of Independence. And of course, the work is about Mohamed Kouassi, who died a long time ago, but it's also about homage to Safia Kouassi, who is obviously trying to carry on the legacy of her husband, as well as talking about her own life story with her husband, their love story, etc., etc. And then we jumped to another example, for example, in Laughter in Hell, this project, which I hope is not a premonition, but Laughter in Hell, because we spend a lot of time in our project giggling and laughing a lot and telling jokes, but I was always interested by jokes and humor, and that also comes from my father, by the way, who is a great joker.
For sure.
Still today, and you have met him, so you know it's true. Yeah. So in Laughter in Hell, in that project, I also did an interview with a journalist, Mustafa Ben Fodir, about this period of the 90s, what we call the décennie noire, the Black Decade, where there was a lot of killings of caricaturists and intellectuals at the time, and how the caricature and the oral jokes were portrayed, were used in order to not only disseminate what was happening in Algeria, but also as a way to relieve perhaps, or to also protest and resist what was going on at the time. And then there was another interview with Elisabeth Perregaux, an American academic who wrote a huge amount of text around this idea of the joke and the humor during wars, and especially in her case, targeted to Algeria. So yes, this format of the interview comes back all the time. The archive also in Laughter in Hell was there. And then you find again the archive, but not, with one interview, perhaps a video interview in the piece that I showed at the Jeu de Paume 2 years ago. And where there, again, I'm looking at the Pan-African Festival of 1969 in Algiers. I do an interview with Nadia Lagoun, who talks about her experience, because she was 18 when the festival happened, and she talks about what it meant as a woman Algerian of that age to experiment this kind of amazing context that was the festival, or this Pan-Africanism that happened there in Algeria at the time, with all those kind of militant groups that were based in Algeria, with all those musicians, dancers, actors, filmmakers from abroad and from Africa who were there. And then in some ways, because I did the Jeu de Paume project, and I was very lucky to have access to a lot of archival material from the Cinematheque of Algiers, I was able to also discover that Algeria in the post-independence, really, the state of Algeria had wanted, it was part of their policy in some ways, to actually create a certain type of cinema, which is a militant cinema, an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, but also anti-capitalist cinema. And the model was a Cuban cinema that was created in Cuba at the time, in the early 60s. So that cinema was inviting a lot of African, Middle Eastern filmmakers, filmmakers who were coming from countries who perhaps didn't have the same relationship to cinema, but Algeria had decided to put money to a lot of those films, and were financing a lot of those filmmakers who were just coming out from decolonized or still perhaps colonized countries. And I can think of Youssef Chahine, Joseph Saab for Lebanon, but many also sub-Saharan African countries. Filmmakers from those territories were also commissioned film. But Algeria didn't stop there. Algeria also wanted to work with international or European filmmakers. And by doing so, they were also opening up that same militant cinema, but to a broader audience, if you want. And then they worked with Costa Gavras on Z, for example, that was commissioned or financed in part by Algeria. We all know about the Battle of Algiers by Gilles Porton-Corvo. To mention another French one, Élise ou la vraie vie, de Michel Drac, was also financed by Algeria. Le Bal from Heteroscola was financed by France, Algeria, and Italy. So there was a very interesting kind of connection between Italy, France, and Algeria in terms of cinema. Let's not forget that the Cinematheque of Algiers was created in '65 with the help of the Cinémathèque Française. So you can see all those kind of links, but they were often linked, they were often political links, because those people in France or in Italy who wanted to work with Algeria or were seeking sometimes help from Algeria, financial help, often it was also because they were adhering to their political kind of anti-colonial kind of ideas. Of course, they needed money to make films, but it's also because for them, Algeria was representing this kind of anti-colonial kind of and a lot of those films were shot, like Z from Costa Gavras, were entirely shot in Algeria. L'étranger de Visconti was also entirely shot in Algeria. So just to finish and to link it to the French Pavilion to come, and for the French Pavilion, of course, I decided to carry on with that research and to actually center the project within 3 countries or 3 cities. So Algiers, Paris, and Venice. Why Venice? Because of course there is a Mostra of Venice, and also because in '66 the Mostra of Venice gave the first prize to a co-production, film co-produced between Algeria and Italy, and it was the Battle of Algiers. So Venice for me had a very interesting, important space, but also because the Biennale is there, you know, and the French Pavilion is set in
so there is this very exciting conceptual link to Venice, of course, you know, to the city where the Biennale is taking place. I think you talked a little bit maybe about the larger political context in which cinema sits, but I think maybe we can add a little bit the personal autobiographical part in your practice, which is extremely strong and very, very present. You know, we also, when we met your parents, you know, for example, and we spent time with them, and you're right, your father is a great joker, but there's also a wonderful warmth, and, you know, they are really extremely warm and lovely people. And I think there's a certain warmth and a very, very powerful human spirit that also is in your work. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how do you see your practice, you know, maybe in this question of activism or humanity, or like how do you convey personal messages? I mean, it's clear that you use in many ways your autobiographical story and who you are as a person, perhaps to talk about the bigger stories. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you see your practice sitting in this discourse.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that each time I make a piece of work and I want to talk about some kind of political context, I always use my experience or the experience of my parents, which is my experience too in some ways, because, you know, we live through what our parents have experienced, you know. And in the case of my parents, it was the Algerian War, it was immigration in France, it was the many languages we were talking. At one point, I was also spending my time between Paris and Belgium. So I was also informed by this kind of other lives that I was spending in Belgium. And I do personally believe as an artist that for me to talk about political issues, you have to talk about the personal, or you don't have to, but it makes more sense to talk about politics via the personal rather than talk. There are some artists who do, you know, it differently and very well, more as an activist kind of artwork. But in my case, it was always, I always felt the personal was important. I have a great relationship with my parents. Like you said, they're very funny and lovely. I mean, really, there is no other word. They're just kind and warm. And then throughout my practice, as I became myself a mother also and an artist, I sought this kind of relationship with curators, with people are interviewing my films. I always, hence why perhaps I often interview people of a certain age, because they remind me somehow, my parents, and often they give that kind of warmth. But that's also the people I know the best. And that's the people I feel I can work the best with. That doesn't mean I don't work with younger. Obviously I have done, but so yes, the personal is important. And I represent also all those kind of past histories, as I was saying, you know. I didn't live the Algerian War, but I can tell you I heard so many stories, and the same for the Pan-African Festival. You know, I didn't live it. I wasn't even born when it happened, and my parents were not even there. But there was a lot of discussion around that kind of very rich period of Algeria, which lasted perhaps till the mid-70s with non-aligned countries and the Pan-Africanism, and then that became also the Pan-Arabism. So that kind of very much informed me as a child. And sometimes you think that children don't understand, but you still, like a sponge, you still kind of absorb all the stories, and it's only later on that suddenly they make sense, or they come back to you. And then you're like, yes, okay, I'm gonna do this. I forgot about the cinema, for example, period with my father. Until recently, I remembered it. Mm-hmm. And my father confirmed the name of the cinema and everything, you know, and yeah, and that was great, you know.
And I think all these stories, I think that you were telling us, and also, you know, that your parents were sharing with us, you know, whether it's the Paris massacre and the Algerians in 61, or your personal biographies, how they arrived and how they constructed a life eventually in France, having their children. And so all of these anyway are in your practice. And I think you're always such a wonderfully sensitive artist to kind of make a synthesis of all those things into the project. And I think what's very exciting, and then maybe Sam will talk a little bit about one aspect of the pavilion that we can talk about, which is the publication part. But I think maybe just to finish, one more question from my side is, you know, this sort of synthesis and then the language of cinema. There is, of course, a creation of, you know, what's real and, you know, what is fiction, and how do you tell a history? How do you tell a past? You know, what does it mean in the present moment? And how does it connect? And I think it was very exciting actually to sit in your living room, not only many, many times in London, but actually also in Paris in the exhibition at the Jeux de Paume a couple of years ago, where you really brought your living room there, and sort of the staging of reality or something, which is also a great departure point for the pavilion. This Sam is just showing the catalog here. But maybe you can tell us just really briefly, before then I give the word to Sam, about this project where you brought your living room with all the objects. And here we have a picture of the living room, all the objects, the furniture, there's a certain warmth, a certain, you know, personal touch that it brings, but at the same time, that's exactly how you talk about history. I mean, you also have a wonderful dress sense that always connects to the 60s. We're seeing you right now as well. You know, there's this playing of time. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the formal choices of bringing that living room there, how that came about, and how this is maybe something we will explore as a little teaser, perhaps also in Venice.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was quite interesting because I was doing a lot of research into the 60s, which is, of course, and for a long time has been my favorite period of time in terms of design and clothing and just the way things were made, etc. 60s, 70s. And then suddenly I was in my living room. I remember with a friend calling me out, just in case she listens to me now. And we're talking about those ideas. And then Colleen says to me, but look around you, you're surrounded by the 60s. And I thought, yeah, she's right, actually. Perhaps I should actually bring my home, my living room, into that space. And the living room for me is very much a space of conviviality, of hosting, of sharing food, conversation. So for me, the living room became in some ways a metaphor for the Pan-African Festival, which was a space of sharing, discussing, listening to music, dancing. I did many parties in my living room in Brixton, many dinners, many conversations, and also that's where my children also grew up. And there is family photos of the children, of my parents in there, but also great kind of small furniture bits that are thing like great designs, you know, and paintings, etc., and a nice collection of film posters from the, you know, vintage film posters from the. I'm somebody who collects. I'm somebody who goes to a vintage fair or to flea markets. That's something I adore doing, and it's a passe-temps. But in that instance, for that piece of the Jeux de Paume, it became more than a passe-temps. It became a part of the work. It became me, you know, making work. And that was really, really nice. Of course, it was painful to have to send all my furniture away and having to buy a new one, because when you've lived for 20 years or more with some furniture. So, and actually when my son came as a Jeux de Paume and said, Mom, what did you do? All our furniture is here, you know. And I said, don't worry, I've got some new ones, you know, at home. But yeah, it was very, very personal. For me, perhaps out of all my practice, this one was the most personal one, because, you know, it had the stains on the sofa, the marks of the cups on the table. It had all those kind of 20 years of traces of my life with my children and my friends in that space, as well, of course, of a lot of 1960s elements. But I must say a lot of those 1960s elements were connected somehow to Algeria, North Africa, or Africa. So I was unconsciously buying, you know, statues and things like that who were made in Africa in the 60s or in Algeria or whatever. So there was still this kind of Pan-Africanism within my own living room without me realizing that unconsciously I had collected this element. So it was just a beautiful kind of encounter that my living room was totally fitting into that kind of the whole Pan-African concept, if you want.
You know, what I think is, if I may intervene, what I think is very, very interesting in this particular kind of employment of your living room, or inserting it into the context of a museum space, in the case of the Jeux de Paume, which is perhaps something that might be repeated in some way or shape or form or not in the context of the French Pavilion, is that there's this very, very interesting conflation of what is real and what is staged, what is fiction and what is real history, what is, it is your living room, but then it suddenly becomes a signifier of something that goes beyond your personal biography. It's activated, there's a new agency that's transported into it just because it's now, being employed or coerced into a different type of staging. And I think that these are some of the conversations that we've been having also together over the last few months. What does it mean to stage a project in the context of perhaps the ultimate form of staging, which is the staging of a nation, the staging of a country? And in a way, this has been also one of the underlying questions that has filtered into the way we've thought about how can you represent these conversations? How can we relate the process of this project in a way that is not just a finished product that you get at the end of the process, but actually something that accompanies us throughout the period? And this is where you came up with this amazing idea that has now started to take shape, which is the publication of the pavilion. So in this way, Zineb, from the beginning, was very, very clear that she did not want to work on a final catalog that you get at the end, when the exhibition opens as a finished product, but actually to create something that grows, that is nurtured by the conversations and the creative process that we're engaged in, and that becomes another form of conviviality. You were talking about your living room as a place of encounter where friends, your extended family of friends and intellectuals and artist colleagues and curators, but your personal family as well, all your worlds converged in that space. And in a way, perhaps this publication, this review or journal, is also another platform for this extended family of friends and intellectuals and artists and thinkers to meet, to come together. And I think this is such a generous gesture on your behalf, Zineb, to kind of not just think about what you want to say, but actually expand it so that other voices are equally included and are given the opportunity to talk about things that are relevant to the bigger questions that you want to evoke and you want to trigger through the project of the pavilion. So as Zineb was saying, the three cities that were very, very important for her throughout her career and her personal life obviously were Paris, because that's where she was born and grew up and lived for many, many years. There's Venice, which is going to be the place where many aspects of her life are going to be immersed and confronted and condensed into the context of a staged national pavilion. But then, of course, there's Algiers, the background, the beginning, in a sense, the history of her personal family, and of course, the questions of post-coloniality, and all the issues that have to do with ideas of identity politics, immigration, and so on and so forth. So 3 journals or 3 numbers of this journal are going to be released over the next few months leading up to the pavilion. And this is the first issue, which this afternoon Yasmina and Zineb will be talking about in more detail at the FIAC. The first issue takes the city of Algiers as its starting point. The second one will focus on Paris. And of course, Traces of London will get into it as well, because that's part of your story too. But then the third one will be the one that focuses on Venice and the Italian context. Of course, always going back to cinema, always going back to the language of cinema and to the history of militant cinema, 60s and 70s, and the co-productions that were happening between these 3 countries within the context of a discourse that was seeking to challenge, perhaps think of projects of nation building, think of post-colonial ways of being and challenging, the narratives that were inherited from previous imperial powers. So I'm going to now switch to my screen just to kind of show you a little bit some of those spreads. So as you can see, we were looking at the cover. And each of the issues will have also a subtitle that goes under the city. So the first one is forms of desire. And in this first issue, we're talking a lot about the desire to make cinema. Why and what kind of forms does desire have? And how can desire be a force? How is desire perhaps a sort of agency that underlines the urge to make film, to create cinema, to capture images, to capture moments in time that can be then re-edited and retold in different ways to challenge a certain status quo or to make us question certain situations that have to do with post-colonial realities. So in a sense, in this case, you can see the language or the visual language of the issues of the journal is very, very much inspired and kind of appropriating the imagery of some of these militant journals or manifestos or reviews that were connected to film, that were connected to music, to festivals like the Pan-African Festival, to certain biennales that were starting to circulate in the region at the time when we talk about the Alexandria Biennale, the Baghdad Biennale, and other places in the world, of course. So you will see a lot of that in the review. This is also a very, very beautiful example. But we'll also see, for instance, that every now and then, names and contributions from artists, colleagues, friends, the extended family, as we were saying, of Zineb pop up, who were very also excited by Zineb's invitation to actually have a certain voice. So for instance, this is an example from Joanna Hadji Thomas and Khalil Jrej, friends and colleagues and collaborators, and their film, Je veux voir, from 2007, 2006, they started working on it, in which they actually trace certain traces, I would say, or they map out certain traces of the experience of the war in 2006 in Lebanon. And then in the middle of the journal, there's always going to be a spread, which is in a way, is very special contribution by Zineb, an edited, a collage that will be a poster that you can then take out and include in your collection of Zinebophilia, and then of course here you see another thing from Loh Kovo, but then there's an opening to other disciplines. So for instance, I want to show you, for instance here, we invited Nabil Jedwani, a very close also part of Zineb's collaborators and friends, to curate a music, a playlist of songs from the period that also comment or relate to these issues. We invited Léa Morin, co-founder of Talitha in France, an independent researcher and film curator, to curate a film program that's also connected to the ideas and the questions that Zineb is asking. And then we reprinted a text that looks at the post-colonial context, as you can see here, within the Australian context. So an opening up on different geographies also to kind of complement different positions and different places and different voices. So you can see this is a very, very heterogeneous, I would say, collection of texts, of images, of reprints, of reproductions, and also of images that relate to the process of research that Zineb has been undergoing over the years, especially in the last year and a half leading up to the Biennale in the Pavilion in Venice, where she has been visiting the Cinémathèque in Algiers, the Cinémathèque in Paris, in Rome, and collecting materials that have been nourishing the research and the work that she's been doing. And some of these images appear in the actual review. So these are all images that Zineb took while doing her research, and these are images that signal a little bit the aesthetic and the forms that we will actually encounter in the pavilion when we actually get to experience it together in Venice. So Zineb, perhaps you want to add a few things about the journal.
Not really. I think you said it all very clearly and very well. I mean, all I can reiterate is this idea of friendship and community, really, whereby for me it was important that people I know, I respect, I read, I respect, to take part when they could, when they wanted, and to give them also a voice within the context of the chosen subject of the newspaper itself. But no, I mean, really, I can't see, I just hope, you know, obviously we send invitations, some people can contribute, some can't. But I mean, so far people have been very excited to contribute in such kind of format. I believe it's the first time at the French Pavilion, the catalog format will take place in free journal in English and in French, then encased in a box, so you'll be able to buy the box at the end of the, when the opening happens in April now, end of April. And of course the box also, you know, another reference to the archives. But yes, I mean, as much as I like going to flea markets, I love going to archives and libraries and museums and look through their archive and I compile tons and tons of images that I find interesting through the iPhone, which has been my savers, my saver. And in some ways, it's the same kind of this idea of collecting comes back also through those images of archives that we put into the journal.
You know what's really special, I think, about this whole kind of endeavor is not only the generosity, I think, that you are extending to all your friends and your colleagues that have somehow either contributed or nourished or inspired or challenged you perhaps at different phases of your life. But I think the whole kind of approach is one that is very, very much, if I could think of one word that kind of summarizes this whole experience, is that of solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way, perhaps we can say that the experience of the project, both the process leading to it, but also perhaps one of the main signals that will be put out there through the installation, through the exhibition itself, is one of solidarity. Mm-hmm. And I think this, in a sense, becomes a way of connecting to that spirit, to that moment in time where in Algiers, as you were saying, but also in many other countries in the world that were coming out from a colonial reality and were thinking about, so what does it mean for us to be independent? What is independence, and what is nation, and what is a people? And in a sense, there was a moment of self-confidence where everything felt possible, everything seemed attainable. So on one hand, a lot of this younger generation of intellectuals and thinkers and filmmakers and artists, of course, visual artists, painters, sculptors, were looking at the past and mining their own histories and mining perhaps certain corners of their history that were completely discarded or marginalized because they were not at all optimal for the colonial power. Mm-hmm. So they were trying to find new sources to build or a vernacular on which they could build their own identity. Mm-hmm. But then very quickly you see that there's a turn towards an openness. It's not enough to just think about in a singular way internally, but the only way forward is to actually create these links and open up the conversation. And I think in a way the project for the pavilion and the way you've been approaching it is a very, very appropriate kind of condensed microcosm of these two lines. On one hand, there's your personal, very, very micro way of looking at your own history. But then at very, very interesting and sometimes unexpected moments, the personal opens up to become collective, to become about conversations, to become about relationships, to become about unexpected alliances. Perhaps this is one of those unexpected alliances with Yasmina, or maybe it is an unexpected one. But this is where the magic starts happening. And this is where new meanings are found, when the personal and the collective conflate and confront, when the real and the fictional also overlap. And I think these are all unbelievably pertinent tropes of thinking and strands that are perfect for the platform of a pavilion. And how do you critique and question that entire construct?
And perhaps just to add one sentence, which I think you've always done so beautifully in your work, it is not really about actually dividing people. I think it's always the opposite. I think you've always tried to bridge. I mean, it's also who you are with your different cultural identities all in one. I think there is this great kind of, creating a sense of invitation and openness that everybody, I think, will be able to find themselves in it and engage and reflect on what is happening. So I think it's going to be an extremely strong presentation that you're working on. I think we can't wait to actually see it come to life. I think there's so many fantastic layers, incredible departures also in your practice as an artist, while totally staying true to who you are as a human being and as a person. And I'm very positively sure that it's something that will appeal to everyone, no matter where they come from. I think everybody will be able to relate and connect and feel, I think, very proud and excited about this representation within the context of the French Pavilion.
Yeah, I mean, the element of participation from an audience will be is something that I am very interested in because I've experienced it with a living room. I mean, in any exhibition, when you show a film or whatever, there is always a participation of the audience because they come into the space, they sit or they don't, but but this is pushed even further when you have somebody sitting in your living room, having a drink, chatting, looking at books or whatever, So that's something I'm really interested in. And obviously we all understood by now that cinema is at the core of the project for Venice, and all the strategies taken and seen and viewed in the making of the film will be explored for the project, and especially the kind of the make-believe kind of aspect of cinema, the trompe-l'œil, all those kind of elements will be there. We can't say more than that, but I think we've said already.
We've said enough. We'd love to say more, but we're not. We're resisting. Great.
Yeah.
But
So,
maybe just to tell people also, Yasmina will be at FIAC with you later today, I think at 2 o'clock. And for those of you who are interested in joining and coming and also getting a copy of the journal, it will be available there, the one that we have here. And
we've got also a French version of that, yeah?
Yes.
We've got the French and English version available this afternoon.
So Yasmina will be there in person,
and we will talk a bit more about the journal with Yasmina. Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zineb, Sam, and Till. Thank you for your time and speaking from your hearts and sharing your experiences, your life work, your childhood, even your friendship. It was an incredible conversation. Thank you. We're now super teased and we cannot wait. Venice Biennale in 2022 and the French Pavilion, of course. And then I'm going to conclude this and thank FIAC, Jennifer Flay and Charlotte Ardon for putting this together, having the idea of giving this space to conversation and allowing everyone to join and listen to these incredible subjects from the comfort of their home or offices everywhere in the world. And thank you for joining. And we hope everyone enjoyed as much as we did creating this conversation. Have a lovely day. And this concludes the conversation room of FIAC this year.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
See you in Venice.